Good evening, everybody, or good morning, as the case, wherever you are. Sri Aurobindo was born in 1872, so that in 2022 he will complete 150 years. It's not just the birth and the passing of a person, but a person who has left behind him such a great lineage of thought and action. He had tried to use a very old-fashioned 19th century word, synthesize the attitudes or the reflective mind, the perceptions, the observations and the thoughts of the West, and the sensitivity and the kind of, the innerness, the spiritual qualities of what goes by the name of the East. Maybe Indic traditions would be a better term to talk about this dharma, Sanatana dharma, this notion of certain ways of life that evolved from this part of the world. Sri Aurobindo has a great legacy, as we know. He has his written works, published works, range into 30 volumes, which is a massive, that itself is a massive kind of collection. He has written on politics, he has written on philosophy, he has written on yoga, he has written on, the sociology of life, ideal of human unity, human cycle, innumerable letters on spirituality, metaphysics, philosophy, yoga, poetry, literature, translations. He has done excellent translations and commentaries on certain mandalas of the Rig Veda, of which we will be speaking now. We'll be talking about that soon. And then he has interpreted the Upanishads. He has written extensively on the Gita. So to cut it short, his is an amazing kind of contribution, and that's probably, it works both ways, because that is probably the reason why, many people are kind of afraid to step into his world. It's not easy to comprehend, to understand a man who has thought so deeply, so profoundly about life and its becoming, the possibilities of human becoming. In the last lecture, I was talking about planes and parts of being and becoming, and the threefold manner in which this transformation takes place, as he has philosophically interpreted in his Life Divine. And I had also given samples and extracted from some of his sonnets, early sonnets, to prove my point that, poetry, metaphysics, philosophy, and yoga, meditation, and reflection went hand in hand in the context of such a mystic, a radical mystic like Sri Aurobindo. He was a saint, no doubt, a Maharshi, an intellectual saint, a person who had been thinking, who has articulated so much, who has written so much. And he is a yogic poet because he has written poetry, and his primary interest was poetry, because today we will be talking about his great magnum opus, the greatest contribution that he has made to the context of poetry, Savitri. The poem itself is an epic, which is one of the longest poems in the English language, running into more than 24,000 lines. And this is sheer, it's not easy to digest it. You can read it with a certain kind of meditative mind, and that is what is required here. He has spoken about the mantra, and this is mantric. This has this sort of incantatory ability to talk. When you read this in a sonorous way, you have to read it with a specific bent of mind and a certain kind of devotion and dedication, because here is a man who has conversed with eternity, who has looked into the face of infinity and experienced the transformation of his soul. It's not a book to be read and finished and laid aside. You have to go back again and again. It's not like any other epic. You read the story and you just leave it like that. You may have to reflect on it. You may have to think about it. Manana, that is very important rather than just merely reading it. The first canto itself, he has written and rewritten so many times, more than 12 times, 13 times. So you can imagine the massive scale to which he has thought about it. And he has been continuously working on this poem, for almost 50 years. That's such a long time in a man's life, in a human's life. And beginning quite early, he went on redrafting it, rewriting it, talking about different yogic states of mind, different experiences. Those of us who are familiar with the text, we are fortunate that we are familiar with the text, because those of us who have read it and reread it and read it with an inner eye, srotas, or inner ear, srotasya srotram, if you listen, if you let the word vibrate in the inner realms of your mind, will certainly find it valuable. For why has he rewritten it? Because as he climbed, as he ascended different levels of experience, he wrote from those planes as well. That doesn't mean that he transformed the whole thing, but he looked at it in different scales. It's a book. It's an epic. It's a long poem, which is the longest in English language, as I just mentioned, which can be read and written and interpreted. Many scholars, very profound scholars who have read it, who have interpreted it, who have written extensively, given discourses on this poem, have on this epic. They have looked at the different aspects of this epic. That doesn't mean that this is exhausted. It is inexhaustible. It's like a gold mine. You can open at any canto, you can look at any book and still start interpreting things differently. It's a poem which Sri Aurobindo has subtitled A Legend and a Symbol. So the legend is already there in the Mahabharata, and everybody knows the story of love and death. And love and death is a theme which he goes back again and again to. More than that, this is a poem which in the second part of the subtitle, he talks about symbol. So there is a symbolic kind of dimension to the whole poem. And that symbol is reverberatory, it is incantatory, it has several dimensions and levels. So we cannot exhaust it, it is inexhaustible. And that inexhaustibility, that profundity and inexhaustibility is something which actually makes this poem quite relevant to our times. These are times when we hardly read anything, because reading has given way to the visual. The auditory has almost, we have forgotten our library. We are laid aside our verbal world, but we have moved into the visual. The technology has taken over, and there are so many other issues. Issues of ecology, for instance, environment, issues which actually threaten human existence or natural existence on a global scale, not only merely the global scale, but on a cosmic scale. Human beings have come to such a pass that we are able to, enter into a new sort of, era where we call it in geological terms. Geologists call it the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is an era where human actions actually tell on a global and cosmic scale. Human, destruction of nature, depletion of biodiversity, pollution, and on a massive scale, we have been able to touch nature and transform it, not in a good way, but in a very bad way. So a certain sense of ugliness is hanging in there when you talk about, ecological debate and environmental crisis. Now, you can ask this question, why environmental crisis and Savitri? And that is exactly what I am going to do here, because very few people, in fact, hardly anybody that I am aware of has done any work on looking at the concept of nature, looking at the way in which nature is represented, the ideas of nature as it is represented in Savitri. So this is not merely, to look at the descriptions of nature and look at the descriptive aspects of nature, sunrise, sunset, the poem begins with light, ends in light, and that sort of thing in a sort of elemental way. But I'm looking at the symbolic levels and looking at the dimensions of nature that Savitri affords. I have titled my lecture, Prakriti and the Manifestations of Spiritual Consciousness, Dimensions of Nature in Savitri, and I am trying to explore the Vedic lineage of an ecological discourse. The Vedic lineage of an ecological discourse means, I'm looking at how Vedas and Upanishads have been brought into Savitri, how the discourses which have already been done in the Vedic texts, which have certainly influenced Sri Aurobindo's thinking. In fact, he accepts that, the Vedic interpretation, Veda's interpretation is the basis of his sort of thinking. So I'm just trying to look at, the Vedic connections and the connections of ecological discourse in Savitri. I have 3 extracts here from Savitri. It's not easy to read through the book and to talk about it within an hour or two, to make a discourse about it. But I've just given 3 extracts here to begin with. This is the first one is from Canto 1, lines 155 to 158. Her being's fiber reached out vibrating and claimed deep union with its outer selves, and on the heart's chords made pure to seize all tones, heaven's subtleties of touch unwearing, forced more vivid raptures than earth's life can bear. Not at one reading, but I am sure that most of you who are listening to me are aware of Savitri. You've already gone through various aspects of Savitri, so these lines would make sense to you. We will interpret it eventually. I'm not going to interpret and over-interpret it. All I am going to do is to give a kind of perception, a total different sort of perception of bringing in concepts of ecology, ecological discourse, environmental crisis in the ideas of nature as Sri Aurobindo has represented in Savitri, in an elemental sort of, symbol as he has developed. Second one, it's a single line. I sacrifice not earth to happier worlds. This is actually the words of Savitri, the heroine, the protagonist in this poem. I sacrifice not earth to happier worlds. So the connection is established here. There is a kind of earth connection, belonging to earth, a sense of belonging, the rapture of, trying to understand what is happening around us in earth. I sacrifice not earth to happier worlds. I can very well get away from here. I can go to nirvana. I can close my mind and go into the spiritual ecstasy. But I am not going to do that. I am going to find connections with earth. Unless and until the last, living thing on earth is transformed spiritually, I am not going to give up my exegesis, my actions, she says. Third one, all happily grows towards knowledge and towards bliss. An inner law of beauty shapes our lives. So there is a sense of beauty and ecstasy that actually shapes our lives. And that is exactly what Sri Aurobindo is trying to establish here. Now, if I need to establish some sort of connection with the Vedic hymns. The mandalas, the Rigvedic mandalas, which Sri Aurobindo himself has translated and recreated, and which also have influenced his way of thinking. Now, the Vedas, to talk about the Vedas generally, if I talk about it, it's not from a fundamentalist perspective, but I am trying to look at it from an Indic perspective. The Vedas, as we already know, the 4 in number, the Vedas are held in a very great reverence as the repository of sacred and revealed knowledge. There is this Shruti and Smriti. This is Shruti. This is all revealed knowledge, and this has a sense of sacred. We will come back to this aspect of sacred knowledge and revealed knowledge eventually when we talk about the biological, ecological crisis. The word Veda means knowledge. It is derived from the root vid, to know, with Vidya, Veda, to know. And knowledge for the ancient Indian was knowledge of how to live, what to live for, and also to live life in a progressively most meaningful manner, all directed towards a spiritually meaningful existence. The accent was more on being and becoming rather than doing and having. It's very important because in the last lecture I also spoke about being and becoming, the transformation that actually hastens the process of spiritualization, the divinization. It is not merely in possessing and holding that life becomes better, but on becoming and being and becoming rather than doing and having. The latter was, of course, dependent on and concomitant to the former, drawing sustenance, directive, and significance from the fourfold division of life. I'll speak about the fourfold division of life as the Sanatana Dharma sees it. Dharma, the righteous path or order; Artha, the meaning or the material possession; and Kama, or love or desire; and Moksha, in terms of liberation. And ultimate, disconnecting from this world, not actually dislocating, but to transform this world. So, now, if we read the Vedas, we depending on the perception that we are able to bring to bear on them, depending on how we approach them, they can guide us in how to be better in our lives, good living. They can manage our lives. As with all early people's narratives, it's an early people's narratives. They haven't gone into the development issues. Of course, you cannot talk about ecology. We will eventually talk about ecology. But ecology, which is a very recent science, which actually developed out of certain chaotic disorder which human beings have effected in this world, this was not there at all. There was no reason for them to be worried. But they were aware of the kind of connections that people are able to organize. The Vedas actually tell us how to live better. And they belong to the early people's narratives. They too provide a twofold significance of life in terms of the exoteric or the outer and the esoteric or the inner, the secretive. And now this is where actually the idea of being as quality occurs. Being should be read as quality. Being in philosophy can be termed as quality when we look at the context of the Vedas. Nature, as it is described in Sanskrit, the word nature as it occurs in Sanskrit, of course, is Prakriti, which could be interpreted in two ways as the nature which covers non-human nature, as we see the outer nature comprising of all non-nature beings, or it could be inner essential characteristic of something, the Prakriti of something, the characteristic of something. So the outer nature was, of course, a continuation of the inner, because all being, cosmic or atomic, was essentially one. Aham Brahmasmi, says the Upanishads. I am Brahman, I am all-pervading. We should know, however, that in this ecstatic statement of enlightenment, the I or Aham does not refer to the individuality or the outer nature, or the ego for that matter, but to the essence of the soul that is ever identical with the spiritual at the heart of being. In my last lecture, I have already spoken about the concept of, the idea of soul, which actually is a spiritual spark, the divine being in the human being. So this I or Aham actually refers to that. Tattvamasi, that thou art, as we read in the Upanishads. The spiritualized vision of nature and being afforded a spiritual aesthetic, because only as an aesthetic relish could the world be finally resolved. The world can be resolved only as an aesthetic, rasa. That is the way in which the phenomenal world is vivarta. It was constantly changing in a flux, because it is virad. It is vivarta, and it also changes, because this could be read as maya or illusion, and the illumined mind can reintegrate itself with the ultimate relish or paramananda, or even the dance of Shiva. Now, the values that the ancient Indian tradition invokes are spiritual. Now, when I talk about ancient Indian tradition, I insist on looking at it in terms of diversity, multidimensional, manifold, heterogeneous, and different. It's not just in one, homogeneous. No, there is a heterogeneity and difference, and there is multiplicity, multidimensionality, and the diversity and manifoldness. They are rooted in a sense of place and time, of course, but transcendental in their significance. They could be seen as, proffering both a bioregional and an ecosystem view of life and living. Now, this bioregional is something which is rooted in the biology of a particular region. And ecosystem view actually relates to the values that individual life in relation to the rest of the world. There is a continuity, there is a web of life which actually percolates the entire living and the non-living universe. The elemental symbolism of the Vedic and Upanishadic mantras are thus rooted in a culture of place and value, while ritualistic and sacred qualities that they evoke are transhuman and transnatural. So both these aspects are there. There is a transhuman and transnatural element, and at the same time there is a place and value in the context, because they speak about certain specific issues which are derived from the living universe. Above all, the ancient Indian cultural outlook was a constant recognition of the sacred at the heart of all being. It's not secret, but the sacred. The sacredness is there at the heart of all being. This notion of the sacred does not devalue the phenomenal world of the senses, but on the other hand, endows this phenomenal world with a deeper significance and value. Now, ecology might be the socially evoked, unified and holistic view of nature for the present, but the ecological vision that a poetic insight engendered through the spiritual would nevertheless enhance all qualities of life and living, both in terms of human and the non-human, for its significance is not merely historically conditioned or limited. Now, why I mention all these things is because, we in the global scale have, in the present day, looking at it from a Western perspective or even Christianized perspective, we could say we have fallen from grace. So because we have fallen from grace, this is like the sacred has disappeared, and we have, instead of the sacred, we have not been able to see the sacred or perceive the sacred at the heart of everything, but we look at things from the point of view of the market values, from utility, and look upon nature itself as mere resource, a resource which just gives us not values but just a price or a market. Now, the absence of a cultural basis for valuing the land that we inhabit is at the root of the human behavior. And this is something which actually degrades and pollutes our world. It's a question of value which actually denigrates our world that we live in. The Vedic vision was essentially a poetic one. Sri Aurobindo repeatedly mentions this in his Secret of the Vedas, in his Synthesis of Yoga, in his Life Divine. He talks about the Vedic vision, which was essentially a poetic one. Probably that is why he kept on, writing Savitri and of course many other poems as well. He was always concerned with poetry, because through poetry he is able to create a poetics which is in line with the Vedic vision. The manner in which the mode and the manner in which the ancient Indian approached nature and life itself was in complete recognition of a holistic and integral poetic vision. Life was seen as a process towards a progressive accumulation of wisdom, a wisdom which is rooted in the sacred, as I have just mentioned. Now, there are innumerable scholars who have actually focused on this aspect of the Vedas, connecting it to ecology and environmental wisdom. Vanuchi is one person who has done extensive study of ecology in the Vedic Hymns, and she has argued that knowledge in the Vedic sense has much in common with what we call science. And hence, truth in the sense in which the ancient Indian seers used it was scientific and verifiable through the senses. So there is a verifiability and repeatability and accountability in the Vedic hymns, as one scholar, Martha Vanucci, has done, who she has tried to show that. Now, if you were to believe Sri Aurobindo, who in one of his observations, he mentions, quote unquote, this is slightly complex, but I will just read it. And I am sure those of you who are listening to me are quite familiar with the texts of Sri Aurobindo. At one time, he writes, quote unquote, at one time, poetry was a revelation to the rays of the life of the gods and man, and the meaning of the world, and the beauty and power of existence. And through its vision and joy and the height and clarity of its purpose, it became creative of the life of the people. That sublime poetry, with its revelation of Godhead and the joy and power of life and truth and immortality, or its revelation of the secrets of the self and the powers of its manifestation in man and the universe, and of man's return to self-knowledge, got into the very blood and mind and life of the race, and made itself the fountainhead of all that incessant urge to spirituality, which has been its distinguishing gift and cultural motive. This is an extract from Sri Aurobindo's Future Poetry, from page 234 to 35 in the 1985 edition. Okay. Now we understand that in many ways, an environmentally self-aware way and vision of life represented in the Vedic mantras, and later conceptually and intellectually formulated in the Upanishadic verses of a spiritual aesthetic, could be seen to antedate the historically conditioned religious doctrines and their attendant practices of a later age. I really would like to underline this distinction between spirituality, as it is mentioned in the Upanishads and the Vedas, from a certain fundamentalist notion of religious practices, which comes much later. This, of course, is a kind of, a change of life. I wouldn't call it a denigration of life, but practices have changed. People give more emphasis to practice rather than the spirit behind the whole thing, the essential wisdom behind these practice. The Vedic and Upanishadic aesthetic, there is an aesthesis which you recognize in the Vedas and the Upanishads. The Vedic and Upanishadic aesthesis calls for a distinct understanding of a poetic vision of human and non-human life. This is something which Sri Aurobindo also explicates through his writings. One that could be resolved not only aesthetically. Eventually, however, as Hindu system of beliefs evolved, a fourfold categorization of life came to be formulated, as I just mentioned earlier, in terms of dharma, the righteous path or order. Now, dharma is Sanatana Dharma, which actually talks about the righteous path or order, and artha, which is meaning, it is material possession, and kama, which is love and desire, and moksha, the liberation or release. Now, at every stage in life, nature portrayed or nature played a significant role and an aesthetic of the spiritual. And this is something which leads towards a kind of holistic revelation of poetics. Nature occurs as a kind of metaphor, as a meaning that would form the other self of nature. There are several levels. Egam sat vipra bahuda vadanti, says the Rig Veda. The sages express it differently. The truth, of course, is one. We have different ways. So in many ways, the concern of Vedic poetry is practical, namely the actual realization of one's own person. It's not merely talking about this and that. It refers to nature and the transformation of nature, of an inner vision of a person, or what it means to be fully human. If you go to the Vedic vision and later intellectual interpretation of the Upanishads, they talk about what it means to be real, complete human being. So the Vedic imagery is symbolic. Sri Aurobindo has reinterpreted it, and he has been repeatedly talking about the symbolic order of the Vedas. It speaks of light and darkness, and the human journey through mysterious darkness to light. Now, nevertheless, there is this progress from darkness to light, but the ancient Indians also have seen darkness at the heart of light. It's very, very important. It's not merely to lead from darkness to light, but then in one of the texts of one of the mantras of the Upanishads, you can read that Hiranmayena patrena satyasyapi hidam mukam tattvam pushan abhavranu satyadharmaya dirshite. The face of truth is covered with a golden disk. Unveil it, O sun, that I who love the truth may behold it. So when there is too much effulgence, too much truth, you do not go beyond that. It's not merely the light itself is not the end of the world. One percolates, one sees the darkness in light. There is a yogic experience. There are yogic levels of yogic experience in Savitri. Ashupati's yoga is there, which is of a kind of distensive, very graphic sort of yoga, and Savitri's, which is very, very intense sort of inner yoga. So there are two levels of yoga which Sri Aurobindo has explicated here, which actually talk about breaking from darkness to light and going beyond light into another light. Now, having mentioned the Vedas, if you look at the Upanishads which actually follow the Vedas in many aspects are, on the other hand, cryptic intellectual utterances in a much more evolved poetic mode. Their language is much more cryptic and more intellectual, and they follow the Vedic insights too. In the words of Sri Aurobindo, quote unquote, the Upanishads are not a revolutionary departure from the Vedic mind and its temperament and fundamental ideas, but a continuation and development, and to a certain extent an enlarging transformation in the sense of bringing out into the open expression all that was held covered in the symbolic Vedic speech as a mystery and a secret. So there is a tremendous intellectual interpretation of the Vedic hymns in the Upanishads. It says it begins by taking up the imagery and the ritual symbols of the Veda and the Brahmanas and turning them in such a way as to bring out an inner and mystic sense which will serve as a sort of a psychical starting point for its own more highly evolved and more purely spiritual philosophy. So there is this is a quote from Sri Aurobindo which actually shows the lineage, the intellectual lineage and the interpretative strategy of the Upanishads and the continuity of the Vedic heritage. Now, Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, as I'm going to argue with soon, is in the direct line of the Vedic and Upanishadic thought. I had to go into a detailed description of its Vedic connection and Upanishadic connection to show that there is this idea of nature as Prakriti and in a different symbolic order which you see in Savitri. And nature in Savitri, as in Vedas and Upanishads, is used as a metaphor for a state of being. And it reveals the hidden possibility of transformation from the material, the inconscient level, to the spiritual, the superconscient, from matter to the superconscious, from the overmental, through matter, life and mind, and beyond the mind, through higher mind, intuition over mind, and then you go right up to the supermental, superconscient. Savitri is the symbolic dawn that revels in its own secret and sacred self. Although it is secret, there is a sacred self. The entire epic is an unfolding of the hidden possibilities of this other self of nature. Now, Indian narratives linking place and humans are diverse and heterogeneous. They couched in diverse perceptions and points of view and filtered through multiple discourses over a long period of time. Savitri's trajectory definitely reveals this close affinity to the eco-spiritual discourse, as I keep on repeating, of difference and oneness. Not merely homogeneity, but difference at the heart of things, the darkness at the heart of light, difference and oneness of intrinsic value in nature and the hidden possibilities of its transformation. Savitri is subtitled as a legend and a symbol. As Sri Aurobindo climbed, like in the Secret of the Veda, he quotes from one of the Vedic hymns, and he says, as he climbed from peak to peak, he espied ever more and what was to be done, that kind of transformation as he climbs, the ascent, he mentions in Savitri. It is graphically described in Savitri. Savitri is perhaps the nearest to a complete expression of an aesthetic of the spiritual that would self-reflexively lead towards a holistic revelation of experimental poetics. Nature as metaphor and meaning that would form the other self of nature. The action in this epic poem takes place in geopsychic realms. That is the other self of nature. The geopsychic realms, that Sri Aurobindo's specific term, in his specific terminology, would be the overmental regions. The poet's yogic practices and the spiritual training, of course, afforded him profound experiences in the interior spaces of the soul, which, according to him, constituted the aesthetic being in man. The soul is the aesthetic being in man, as he has very clearly mentioned. Savitri is perhaps the longest poem in the English language, which I have mentioned, running into 12 books and 49 cantos, and the poet constantly worked on it for nearly 4 decades. The very fact that a person of the intellectual caliber and the poetic ability, like insightfulness, like Sri Aurobindo, kept on going back to this poem for almost 50 years shows that, he took it quite seriously. So it takes off from a small anecdote in the Mahabharata. It is a legend which is mentioned. Of course, in the Mahabharata, it has its poetic dimensions and situation too. Not merely, but he just plucks off the anecdote from the Mahabharata and he conceives of it as a legend and a symbol. The entire text is an unfolding of the image of aesthetic transformation in symbolic terms. This is my argument. So there is an aesthetic transformation of nature which actually takes place in this poem. So selected cantos and situations I'll just read to see how nature and human nature undergo a transforming divinization that does not forego difference and identity. This is my point. I need to highlight it at every stage. Some extracts we will casually read through and then we will see how it is. Now we have to recall certain things which I have said. Sri Aurobindo's vision is essentially a poetic one, very much in line with the Vedic seers. And he was always concerned with the poetic experience, both the creative and the critical aspects, because he kept on describing about poetic process. He has written extensively, his discourses and his critical thesis itself shows that he was thinking constantly about the critical mind that operates in poetry and the critical mind that operates on poetry. Both the creative and the critical aspects. His writings range from political pamphlets to sociological treatises, which I have just mentioned, exegesis on the Vedas, the Upanishads, and he has also written essays on the Gita to the systematic treatises on yoga and its various dimensions, from critical thinking on the foundations of Indian culture, which is a massive discourse, and history to philosophical writings on the meaning of spiritual being and the poetics of spiritual transformation. Now, what remain common throughout his writings are his aspect, or this particular aspect of spiritual transformation and an aesthetic of spirituality. So this is my point, that there is a continuity. The link that connects all his various writings are this spiritual transformation and an aesthetic of spirituality. This is the heart of Sri Aurobindo, in fact. This reaches its culmination in his 2 major contributions. In the Life Divine, this is achieved through philosophical ratiocination. There are several people who say that Sri Aurobindo is not a systematic philosopher. He himself has said, I am not a systematic philosopher. Now, in terms of academic sort of, arguing, he is not like a philosopher. But at the same time, he is considered as a radical philosopher, a radical mystic. There are scholars who consider him as a radical mystic because he departs from the normal, the order of the mystics, but he goes beyond that and he goes into the kind of, to catch things by the roots. He is radical and he is rational at the same time. So he's a radical mystic, and he talked about these things philosophically in the Life Divine. And in Savitri, he uses it as a kind of aesthetic experience. Now, based on his own intense personal yogic experience and on clear-sighted poetic and interpretative exegesis of the Vedic mantras, as it is given in his, Secret of the Veda and translations of Vedic hymns, Sri Aurobindo avows that all life is yoga. What he intends here is a possibility to willfully integrate the human will with its divine counterpart, the integration of the inner and outer nature, a union that would spiritualize all being ultimately. All existence in his vision is a perverting of the spirit. And this is not mere pantheism. For the concept of God that Sri Aurobindo resorts to is not one that is monolithic or homogeneous. Ishvara or personal Godhead. The entire cosmic play or Leela of the divine is the transformation of life from its merely material, inconscient state, in Sri Aurobindo's own terminology, to that of being gradually and systematically self-reflective and self-conscious as spiritually superconscient. Sri Aurobindo argued that from matter to mind and from matter to life and from life to mind, there's a progressive evolution of the already involuted spirit. And now that such an evolution from matter to mind had been achieved, there is further possibility of attaining the other steps in the future evolution. Now, there is a whole progressive sense of creative evolution that is the hallmark of the late 19th century and early 20th century thought. Sri Aurobindo continues that in the kind of creative elan vital, the notion of creatively unfolding and creatively evolving. But he links it to the spiritual transformation of the Indic thought of Vedas and Upanishads, and integrated it poetically in his epic Savitri. Sri Aurobindo, on the strength of his spiritual achievement, categorizes these levels of being as higher mind, illumined mind, intuition, and overmind. These are stages to be reached before achieving the complete divinization of all being, matter inclusive, in the supramental transformation. In Savitri, he finds the right situation for developing his schema of spiritual evolution. One needs to keep in mind that the poetics of Savitri is in direct line with the Vedic, and the symbolism is deliberately elemental. Sri Aurobindo's involvement with the Vedic texts and the mantras in the Sanskrit language afforded him an entry into the profound elemental quality of the language of poetry. Savitri is created as dhyana mantra, and the desired attitude of reading is also to be meditative. A few instances from the long poem would explicate this. Just one extract I have given. In the earlier, I began this lecture with citations from Sri Aurobindo's own language. In the enormous spaces of the self, we read in Savitri, in Canto 1 itself, in the enormous spaces of the self, the body now seemed only a wandering shell. Of course, he uses English language very, very specifically. He has this whole burden of the Greek, the Germanic, and the Teutonic mind, and at the same time the Sanskrit sort of, the whole notion of the semantics of the word and the word order. Now, in the overmental aesthetic, as evinced by Sri Aurobindo, the highest intensity of the poetic speech and poetic vision combine to give rise to what he calls the mantra. Mantra is possible when the highest reaches of the poetic speech and the poetic vision come together to synthesize into one. Reading from Book 4, Canto 2, from lines 289 to 96, I quote from Sri Aurobindo's own Savitri to show the possibility of the highest speech and poetic vision as he tries to evince the progressive awareness of the finding of the mantra. As blooms a flower in an unvisited place, the wide world knew not yet the inhabitant flame. Yet something deeply stirred and dimly knew. There was a movement and a passionate call, a rainbow dream, a hope of golden change. Some secret wing of expectation beat. A growing sense of something new and rare and beautiful stole across the heart of time. Now, this mantra, or the highest intensity of poetic expression, is reached when the sound and the sense, shabda and the artha, the sound and the sense combine in the right order. Shabdartha sahidam kavyam. Bhamaha has said that. In Indian poetics, in Sanskrit, Shabda and Artha, when they come together, the highest poetic speech is created. In Book 7, in Canto 6, between lines 405 to 408, 4 lines, 408 to 405 to 8, quote unquote, only sometimes small thoughts rose and fell, like quiet waves upon a silent sea, or ripples passing over a lonely pool when a stray stone disturbs its dreaming rest. Unquote. Now, the text of Savitri, 24,000 lines, more than 24,000 lines, is replete with unique instances like this which I have given. However, it is when the poet moves into the terrain where the geography of the imagination intercepts the ordered measures of poetic utterance that he excels himself and appears to touch the highest possibilities of expression. Once long ago, I recall, this is a kind of personal aside, one of my professors, in the sense not a professor who taught me directly, but who was my examiner for my PhD dissertation, Professor C.D. Narasimhaya asked me, Murali, can you cite some lines from Savitri which actually reverberate in the mind, which actually are able to evoke the idea of dhyana mantra? So I remember, citing this, where this is the situation where Satyavan, Death and Savitri, the trio, are moving into the realms of the beyond. As you know, the entire poem revolves around the notion of love and death, and then bringing back the dead Satyavan. There are symbolic dimensions. We'll just look at briefly at the symbolic levels eventually. But right now, I'm just trying to cite this possibility of the silence, which he talks about, the mantra that he is able to evoke through silence. This progressive, the process of death, Satyavan, Death and Savitri move into the realms of the beyond, quote unquote, in Book 9, Canto 1, lines 211 to 219, quote unquote, luminous, he moved away. Behind him, death went slowly with his noiseless tread, as seen in dream-built fields of shadowy herdsman, glides behind some wanderer from his voiceless herds. And Savitri moved behind eternal death. Her mortal pace was equalled with the gods. Wordless she travelled in her lover's steps, planting her human feet where his had trod into the perilous silences beyond. Now, to read Savitri is to witness a tremendous adventure in the interior realms, to witness and participate in a kind of multi-dimensional quest. Because Savitri is created in the mold of great poetry, Mahakavya. I have argued elsewhere in another lecture also. I have been saying that Savitri comes in the direct line of Dandi's notion of Mahakavya. The requisite state of mind when you read Savitri is one of hope, openness and humility, a receptivity similar to that of prayer. When you are praying, you need to do that. For each word and each phrase should ring in the solitude and an immensity, heard in the listening spaces of the soul, in the inner acoustic space, and seized by the deeper self. In one of his early writings, future poetry, in somewhere around about 1910, Sri Aurobindo has recorded, to embellish life with beauty is only the most outward function of art and poetry. To make life more intimately beautiful and noble and great and full of meaning is its higher office. But its highest comes when the poet becomes the seer and reveals to man his eternal self and the Godheads of its manifestation. And this highest function is what he has achieved in this work. He was convinced that, to quote unquote, our souls can visit in great lonely hours still regions of imperishable light. Although he uses a gendered sort of language using man, feminists might protest, but then we should remember that the protagonist of this poem is a female, and his whole idea of Savitri, in terms of sensuality, in terms of the way she looks at nature, the way she responds to Satyavan, the way she responds to everything around her, it is feminist in several ways. It's a moot point, which we will keep for another lecture. Now, the poem is such, it's replete with such images of nature, the outer and the inner. There is this description of the inner nature, the outer nature. And Sri Aurobindo wields the English language with the expertise and ease in order to capture the multiple nuances of spiritual experience. The tantric dimensions of the yogic experience are very unique, and in an equally unique manner, Savitri unfolds the rapture and distress, the pain, the pleasure, the effort, and the ease. The poem opens with the symbolic dawn with its stark opening lines. We should remember it was the hour before the gods awake. And it ends with the dawn that Savitri nurtures in her soul. The entire span of the poem is concentrated on the fateful day of Satyavan's death and Savitri's encounter with the dark god, because as the opening canto reminds us, in her there was the anguish of the gods, and her nature felt all nature as its own. Nature is not merely on the outside, but it connects to the soul, the psychic being in Sri Aurobindo's scheme of things. God found in nature, nature fulfilled in God. After the process of divinization, as Sri Aurobindo visualizes this, the raw nature in us is transformed. We continue to act in this world. We don't leave this world as such. We continue to act in this world, doing and having, being and becoming. But our actions are transformed spiritually. There is a qualitative transformation. This is where the idea of quality also comes in. In his essays on the Gita, he writes, quote unquote, slightly dense, paragraph, but kindly listen. Action is possible. I quote from Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita. Action is possible without the subjection of the soul to the normal degraded functioning of the modes of nature. Action is possible even when you transform yourselves qualitatively beyond nature. The functioning depends on the mental, the vital, and the physical limitations to which we are cast. It's a deformation, an incapacity, a wrong or depressed value imposed on us by the mind and its life in matter. When we grow into the spirit, the dharma or inferior law of nature. Now, dharma does not mean dharma, as I mentioned earlier, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, that dharma. Dharma is the essential characteristic of nature here. It talks about nature, the function of nature is replaced by the immortal dharma of the spirit. There is this experience of free, immortal action, a divine, illimitable knowledge, unlimited knowledge, a transcendent power, an unfathomable repose. We have the thing we seek in us, but we have in practice to evolve it out of the inferior forms of our nature. We have what we seek inside us. We just have to recognize and allow nature to take us beyond that. Nature has a secret purpose and a meaning in Sri Aurobindo. And that is the divine fulfilment. This insight is what has inspired the poet to construct a vast, multi-dimensional epic around a simple theme of love and death. The idea of love and death is raised into a symbol for a spiritualized transformation. The entire poem is a kind of study in human and non-human nature. The action takes place in the interior dimensions of being. There are two major yogic journeys in this immense epic, that of Ashupati's and later of Savitri. There are two yogas. Several cantos are devoted to the large segment is for Ashupati's yoga and then Savitri's yoga eventually. Sri Aurobindo has transformed the minor narrative in the Mahabharata into an epic of a spiritual and symbolic significance. And that is his whole project. Now, I don't think we need to go deeper into the symbolic levels, because most of you are, you are taught, you are trained in looking at the several dimensions, but I'll just touch upon this in one or two sentences and move into my closing arguments. The tale of Satyavan and Savitri is simple enough. The king Ashupati has a daughter Savitri who falls in love with Satyavan, the son of a dispossessed and blind king Dumatsena. It is foretold that Satyavan has to die within a year of their marriage. Savitri is undaunted when they are married. When Satyavan dies at the destined time, Savitri awaits the Lord of Death to come and possess his soul. She follows the soul into the nether realms, just like Dante in Divine Comedy. Despite her repeated requests, Yama, the Lord of Death, is unrelenting in granting her the life of Satyavan. Nevertheless, she persists and is finally able to overcome death with her perseverance and single-minded commitment. One is reminded of Kathopanishad, where Nachiketas goes down to counter Yama and ask questions, pestering, not pestering, but repeatedly going after with a kind of perseverance, clinging on to the truth. Nevertheless, she persists and is finally able to overcome death with her perseverance and single-minded commitment. Satyavan is finally reunited with Savitri in an eternal happiness. Now, in the dimension of the symbol, the two kings, Ashupati and Dumatsena, represent power and knowledge. This is very significant in the present day world. Order and civilization and culture depends on the way in which we are wielding power. Power is the structure around, everything is structured around notions of power. But at the same time, there is this level of knowledge which actually controls power. So there is the connection between knowledge and power. So there are these two people, Ashupati and Dumatsena, who are presented in the symbolic order of power and knowledge. Knowledge needs to reflect on its own self, and power requires willful insight so as to be just and non-oppressive. Power is always on the oppressor's. If it falls into the oppressor's hands, there is this structure of ominous oppression and degradation, control and colonization, expansion, the whole discourse of oppression and creation of violence. All those things are there in this notion of power. So it requires to be integrated with a kind of divine wisdom. And Savitri herself is the embodiment of the goddess of that name, the harbinger of the great transformation. Dumatsena, the lord of the shining horse, the king of knowledge here, is the lower hemisphere, Aparardha, as opposed to the higher Parardha, and the father of Satyavan. And the father of Satyavan falls blind and loses his kingdom. At the level of symbol, this is knowledge without insight. His son Satyavan, symbolizing the growing soul of man, a prince, a king to be, who cannot live without the support of light and truth in the darkness of this creation, therefore, is destined to die within a year. Ashupati, Savitri's father, is the lord of the horse. Ashwa means horse, of course. And Ashupati is involved in a certain tapasya, concentrated in a kind of spiritual ascesis, a spiritual effort dedicated to the Divine Mother. And Savitri is herself dedicated to the Divine Mother, because Savitri is the goddess of that name, goddess of supreme truth, calling her to support his spiritualized work on earth. Ashupati goes and calls upon Savitri to come down and to take up his spiritual work on earth with hers, or to give support with her help. In the event of her not supporting, his work has no significant future, since he has nobody to continue his lineage. He needs her support. Now, Goddess Savitri has promised Ashupati whatever he wants. Okay, you will, not that you will get many sons, but because you will get a daughter, he says. Now, this is the reason why her Savitri in her human embodiment becomes a value which is decided by the elemental nature. The world's desire compelled her mortal birth, and that is very important. Savitri's presence itself, Savitri's descent itself is desired by the world's desire. Now, the symbolic potential of this story, love and death, overcoming death in terms of insightful power and insight, wisdom. This story afforded Sri Aurobindo with the format of a spiritual transformation that informs his entire philosophical system that was grounded in the Vedic order, which I have just mentioned. in the beginning. I have been trying to link it to that. Ashubhati undergoes several yogic experiences that transcend the phenomenal world and looks into the heart of being. The first segment of this longish poem narrates his inner journeys, his explorations, the entire yoga for that matter. First few books, he resurfaces in the real world with assurance that the goddess Savitri, the goddess of the sun, Savita, would herself reincarnate in earthly form and as his daughter, and equip herself with the because with her ascesis, with her yogic experience, she equips herself for the inner final transformation of all life. She has to undergo the entire gamut of human experience: the joy of love, the pangs of separation, the agony of death, and the ordeal of foreknowledge of death, and the parable of the search for the soul. So that is, she has to live through the entire nature of life, the characteristic of earthly life. All these kind of tensions and paradoxes she has to undergo. The third part of the epic is set apart for the great dialogue with death. So first the yogic journey of Ashubhati, then the yogic journey of Savitri, the inner realms, and then you have the dialogue with death. Now these structures have overtones of the Upanishadic dialogue in terms of language, imagery, and situation. Now, perhaps the entire poem is too complex and replete with symbols, and the enormity of its structure could even put off any simple-minded reader. Anyone who thinks that, okay, Savitri is just a narrative, we can open it and read it. He'll be put off, not merely by the density of language, the inner vision of the poet, but the whole symbolic structure itself is quite complicated. But considering the massive scheme and the complicated structure that Sri Aurobindo had wanted it to be, it is unique in its conception and execution. Exploring the ceaseless miracle of the self in nature and its ultimate divinization. The poem is not merely meant to be read and understood. It is conceived as an exercise in meditation, dhyana mantra, as I have just argued, and inner listening with the ear of the ear. We read in Savitri, in Book 3, in Canto 2, heaven is too high for outstretched hands to seize. That man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what is a heaven for? So similarly, in that way, Browning's perception has come here. Heaven is too high for outstretched hands to seize this light. This light comes not by struggle or by thought. In the mind silence, the transcendent acts, and the hushed heart hears the unuttered word. So that is the level of transformation that happens in Savitri. The great transformation or the divinization of inconscient matter is achieved through the descent of the spirit. And the hushed heart needs to be prepared for and listen to the unuttered word. In the Aurobindian scheme of things, nature is not merely matter or a term that describes the natural forms other than the human. He looks upon nature as the foundation for all life forms to generate from. Nature is the foundation from which life generates, and from life mind has generated. From mind, all the grades and parts of being go into the overmental regions, into the supramental. Nevertheless, it is inconscient and ignorant. Maybe it is inconscient and ignorant, but there is a vibrant horizontal movement of the innate energy in nature that passes through all matter. And still there is another subtle vertical dimension of this manifestation as well that passes through and flowers forth as life, the vital energy. So there is a horizontal power, there is a structure of verticality as well. Eventually, as Sri Aurobindo visualizes it, the vertical thrust would guide the evolution of the supermind. Thus, the transformation of nature would eventually be completed with the complete divinization of all being. This is the objective of what he called the Purna Yoga, the distinct version of yoga defined as integral yoga in the Aurobindian scheme of things, as he envisioned it, because yoga, a self-reflective process, as he sees it, it hastens the process of nature. Now, it is the nature of all being to understand the process of evolution, because all evolution is in essence the heightening of the force of consciousness in the manifest being, so that it may be raised into the greater intensity of what is still unmanifest. From matter to life, from life into mind, from mind into the spirit. So this evolutionary growth into the supramental state is what he visualizes as the process of life divine. Divine being and divine living. Thus, to conclude, Sri Aurobindo's aesthetics is quite integral to his spiritual system. It is characteristic of him that his poetry and thought form one coherent whole. They are expressive and expressions of his own unique spiritual experience and realization. For him, human phenomenal earthly existence is real, and he visualizes with godlike intensity the topography of human evolution. The ultimate divinization of human being would hasten a superhuman being, not a superman in the Nietzschean sense, with a sense of power and potential to destroy, but a spiritually evolved superman. The consciousness that is involuted in nature has to vertically ascend through all other grades of being, only to gradually realize the divine gnosis. This is the ultimate purpose of all existence, as Sri Aurobindo envisions it. Now, nature has a great significance in all this ascent, descent, and integration. It is the foundation for this divine transformation. We cannot just dismiss nature and material existence to go into the higher levels of being alone, but we have to recognize the place of nature in the Aurobindian scheme of things. He wrote later in a letter, in one of his letters he writes, quote unquote, "I used Savitri as a means of ascension." This is something which is familiar to most of us who have read his letters. "I began with it on a certain mental level. Each time I could reach a higher level, I rewrote it from that level. In fact, Savitri has not been regarded by me as a poem to be written and finished, but as a field of experimentation to see how far poetry could be written from one's own yogic consciousness and how that could be made creative." This is a very important point that he makes here, which helps us which gives us a key to interpret the poem in this way. And as in the Upanishads, which according to Sri Aurobindo are the highest type of poetry, the aesthetic harmony of the absolute would lead to a principle of love and understanding and compassion. The Upanishad extols the principle of self-renunciation and abandonment. Tyaga, tena bhumjita, says the Isha Upanishad. And the ultimate relish that follows this process of tyaga. Sri Aurobindo's experience, which he has created in terms of Ashubhati as he surrenders to the divine, is hardly different. You read in Canto 3, you can see that, Sri Aurobindo talks about Ashubhati's yoga and how he realizes in letting go, he becomes the ultimate, he engenders the ultimate relation. When the little self of being is revealed for what it is and unites with the larger will of the divine, all distinctions and differences are seen for what they are, intrinsically meaningful and spiritually charged. The one in the many and the many in the one is a mystical oceanic experience, and Savitri leads the reader directly into such a liberating aesthetic experience. In the final analysis, this long epic would focus on how nature and human nature undergo a divinizing transformation that does not forgo difference and identity. I need to repeat this point because it does not do away with difference and identity. And this is the spiritual aesthesis that Sri Aurobindo visualized. This holistic sort of transformation of the involuted sphere of all nature is a desire of the earth's ecological self which I have taken pains to argue over this presentation. The charmed circle that Savitri weaves together is the charm of an ascent, descent, and integration. The wisdom of ecologically sensitive theory, as we have already seen, has been to re-establish vital connections with nature. When once the living relationship has been rediscovered, nature will come to be looked upon less and less as mere resource, and its sacred other self would slowly come to light. We will learn to look upon nature with the same kind of sacredness that the seers have already spoken about. In our collective globalized march of development in the present, we tend to devalue everything, because the market capitalism entertains only price and cost, not value, as we have already seen. Value and significance are perhaps a thing of the past and are already under the rubble of the garbage heap, which we keep on discarding day by day. We are polluting the rest of the world. Perhaps if we were to resuscitate the collective cultural value of a lost time and of a lost people, the marginalized or even misunderstood so far, we could still save this, our lonely planet. All our preservation, conservation, biodiversity management, and environmental justice movements would hasten us back to the time when nature could hold forth meaning and value. After all, there is this underlying aesthetic value that holds all life together and makes it collectively meaningful. And a realization of this would mean a step towards the aesthetics of the spiritual. This is very significant, because this is not to bring back a lost time, but to understand the wisdom which we have laid aside. The ancient Indian view of life was a constant recognition of the sacred at the heart of being. And as I have argued a little earlier, this notion of the sacred does not devalue the phenomenal world of the senses, but a recognition of this aspect of life, on the other hand, would endow it with deeper significance, quality, and value. The ecological vision that a poetic insight engendered through the spiritual would enhance all qualities of life and living, both in terms of the human as well as the non-human. After all, life becomes more meaningful when lived from within, more self-consciously, more deliberately, in perfect symphony with spiritual values. And the process of transformation is never exclusive but inclusive. In the final analysis, the spiritual aesthetic of nature hastens in a life of quality and pure being, unbounded, unconditioned, but one that is conceived in difference and oneness at the same time. Thank you.